Hello.
Hey. Yep. So this guy today is going to talk about Nazi pseudo-archaeology, which pretty
Right.
much is all their archaeology. So
Of course. Yeah, for sure.
in fact, even on Wikipedia, it doesn't even say pseudo-archaeology. It just says Nazi archaeology, and then as soon as you read it, it says is a branch of pseudo-archaeology. So there, but
Yep.
for me, I don't even like calling it archaeology when it isn't.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't ever say. So I'm just reminding you. If someone ever says those two words together, there is no such thing. They never did anything but bullshit.
Yeah. Right.
So don't. If they say Nazi archaeology, you just go for the favorance of bullshit. I mean, it was total propaganda. There was at zero quality. That's all I'm just trying to say. Is it's not like because sometimes there's science stuff. Even though the Nazis are one of the worst things ever. They did do some things that were science.
Right.
They violated ethical laws all over the place, but they still did science. They didn't do archaeology. That's what
they
I'm trying
just
to
never ever did, actually.
You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Just horseshit, like from the fucking beginning to the end. Like, everything they did was just so mired in horseshit. You can't even. There's no quality. That's all I'm just trying to say.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
So I think that's the most important. But he'll talk about stuff, too. But also, I really am interested in hopefully talking to him again because he does a lot with languages and DNA, and he knows about the movements from ideas of religion from China all the way to Native Americans. So
wow.
I definitely, want to talk to him about all that because I especially remember after all the 15 videos, we were going to start doing the Americas. Remember, that's where we needed the Mound Book and all that, just extra stuff about the Americas and,
Right.
So he knows about that stuff. Hell yes. I want to talk about that more than I want to talk about Nazis.
For sure. Yeah, that's right. It's actually interesting as opposed to just awful.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. But I still think it's important. Like I said, just like I was making the point to you that we can't ever see it as real. Or like credible of it, or that people can't say, well, they did good. No, they did not do any good. Even if you're trying to be the most charitable.
Right. Yeah. They definitely still did no good.
Right. That's what I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So I wanted to address that. And also I feel like it's just one more thing because they were super big into, of course, Atlantis.
Of course.
Which is like, you're right. Like, that's why we did that show we talked about before about how important Atlantis, even though the first year you're like laughing, who cares Atlantis? You're like, actually, that was almost the excuse for killing Native Americans.
Right.
That was almost the excuse for the Nazis. Jeez, so you start to go, okay, wait a minute. Even though that story in a sense is like, something we would consider fanciful, childish, whatever, or not true. Or, I mean, I've never, even when I was a Christian, I didn't like when people said they believed in Atlantis. It's not like I was like, oh yeah, that sounds totally reasonable. No, I always thought it was a story. So I mean, there's 0 point in my life. I mean, some people, even archaeologists, just people know. There's some archaeologists, like even John Hoops said, that he did when he was younger, kind of entertain or was interested in that stuff.
Right.
I never was. And so that was super not hard for me to, in a sense, feel need to debunk it since I never believed it.
You never were invested in it being true.
Exactly. But what I didn't know, which is why I think it's important to talk about, I didn't know is how important it was towards the racism justifications for the Americas to take over native land, that natives never owned the land. It's crazy when you fucking hear that. You're like, what the fuck?
Right.
Like you reading that book that we're reading, which is about the myth of, the great white race, and Atlantis coming to Americas. And this is what's so crazy about the mound builder belief in a general kind of a thing. It also relates to the Mormons, the Book of Mormon, and all those beliefs really relate to Atlantis and all this similar shit. Which is, I mean, because
from a like an objective scientific worldview, this is like this is nonsense, but like
Oh, yeah.
people believe it, and it informs their actions and informs the way they behave.
Exactly. And that's why, like I said, even though to me, like I said, I never believed it ever. So to me, it's like, just sounds like stupid. Like someone goes, well, I really feel that, Superman is real and we need to find kryptonite, and you're like,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So for me, that was in a sense never an issue, but it is, but that's also what I've realized is I'm making these shows not for myself.
Right.
Right. I'm making them for other people. So that's why sometimes topics that I have zero desire to ever talk about them, including talking about the Nazis either, really, but but I do it because I care, and I know that there's a lot of people believe in this shit, and you need to understand that.
Yeah,
and it's not only is it bullshit, but that fucked up people believe this, and that they think it justifies their hate.
Yeah,
I mean, fuck.
Yeah, for sure.
So I feel like that makes the issue more important.
I think that's a fair assessment,
right, to address.
Yeah.
So and in general, so like about my kind of anarchism, I say mutualism, but I generally don't mean it exactly as the mutualism economic
right
theory or something. Absolutely, probably almost not.
Right.
But yeah, that's not but I do agree with mutualist banking, because I told you in my view, I don't because some communism believes in no more money.
Yeah, that's my communism.
Right, but to me, as an axiologist, if money is a term for a kind of universal value that is transferable. And so to me, there's no time when that is not in play. Even in, let's say, communism world that I want, people are going to give things. People are going to need things. If you have no value on things, there's no such thing as work. You may do labor, but it has no meaning outside of value. The only reason labor has value is because you have a concept of value. If you remove value, then everyone just does stuff, but nobody gets, in a sense, credit. Nobody gets, in a sense, benefit. You're simply just making sure everyone's needs are met, in a sense. If you're not dealing with value, you're just saying everyone's going to get I could talk about before when I say pizza. I bring a pizza into a whole group of people and say, oh, I'm going to give the group pizza, but then I only single out one person, like capitalism, and give them like 95% of the pizza, and then everybody else, like 30 people, have to cut up the one piece.
Yeah,
that's capitalism to me. But so I don't want anything close to that, because that's inherently just horseshit. But like I told you, in my society, I do think we should have where everyone's needs are met. And for me personally, that doesn't just include, like some people just say housing or food. I think clothing. Who the fuck can go without clothes? I'm just saying, it's not even a realistic. That's like some fantasy bullshit that you don't think people need clothes. Hey,
hello there.
Right. I addressed before, just so you know, that one of the reasons, even though I don't believe in Atlantis, and that when I was a Christian, which is like 30 years ago, but when I was a Christian, I didn't ever believe in Atlantis. So it was, once I became an atheist and I also started dealing with history, it was very not hard for me to know Atlantis was nonsense, because I never believed it was anything but nonsense. But I was saying is I didn't get how it's so connected to racism, so connected to this like anti-intellectual, anti-science type. I didn't realize that. It's really John Hoops that helped me grasp it's more bigger and ugly importance, in a sense, which is what I think goes to the Nazis also.
I heard that you wanted to discuss the Nazi connection, so we're going to focus on the Nazis this time. But to be clear, there has been an interest in Atlantis going back to the 19th century and earlier. The modern fascination with Atlantis has not just been on the far right. So there has always been you know what I mean? In other words, it's always been one branch of the Atlantis crowd has been that. And so we'll talk about their significance. And the problem is that when you have a Nazi faction in your movement, it means they're going to, and Nazis tend to be a little closeted. They don't tend to be like not everything. Certainly since World War II, they haven't worn it on their sleeve. So there's been a lot of people who dabble in both the far left and the far right wing. It's like, have you heard of horseshoe theory? When you get the
I don't agree with horseshoe theory, since I feel that there's 4 quadrants of things, and so someone could do similar behavior. But I feel like just want to make real quick to make a point. So horseshoe theory is talking about left and right, but I believe in north and south, and that's where I think that the issue is. Like, you could have a far right and a far left, but if they're both authoritarians, not going to be that different. And
there's lots of axes. There's lots of axes that you can chart. So I'm not arguing for a simplistic, like, black and white horseshoe theory here. I'm saying that
sometimes when people say that, they do
people that. In practical terms, like, authoritarian movements in the past have toggled between far left and far right wing authority. Like think about early fascist Mussolini. Mussolini was a left wing authoritarian before he was a right wing authoritarian, right? He set up and you can see people who dabble with different forms of authoritarianism, and because human beings are incredibly fickle, people are not intellectually consistent. You can argue that there's an underlying hypocrisy there.
You could just say that, I think, in general. I think people's hypocrisy are not really consistent.
Right. Hypocrisy is so common, especially among scam artists and people who are interested in selling something. Like, in other words, ends justify the means, which is a very common. People have objectives. They have goals. They want to connect with people. They want to build a coalition. They want to get a movement. They want to access to a certain audience. So they're very, very quick to change personas, to change their entire worldview, even if necessary, to gain a different constituency in their coalition. So
I agree, because to me, Hitler, if you look at his personal, not what he did, but like his personal sort of politics, to me, it's center, not left or right. It's center authoritarian. Now, how he behaved was far right authoritarian. And so like you said, that wasn't his personal politics.
But I mean, look at the way I live in New England, and I've been in New England for the last 3 presidential cycles. And I can tell you very, very much that the white working class in New England toggles between Trump and Bernie Sanders. There is a kind of boomer who hangs, a deadhead boomer. These are like ex-hippie old people that hang around in dive bars. And I know for a fact that they go easily between democratic socialism and Trumpian authoritarianism. And they do it because they went to Woodstock, but they don't like immigrants. You know what I mean? It's like they have these two different, on the one hand, they have like elements of flower child libertarianism, but populism is the opposite of libertarianism. But it doesn't matter, because it's really a cult of personality. It's about people who speak to something inside them, right? They, like, on the one hand, they're still mad about the Kent State massacre. On the other hand, they want illegals to be shot from the top of a tower. So it's like there's a complete and total disconnect between these two sets. You know what I mean? It's fundamentally hypocritical. And I'm sad, because they're like my parents' generation. They're people, I know the kind of thinking they have. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm like people that age are just slightly older than me. And I wish
I have a similar thing to that too. It's like online, I have a lot of people who are communists, authoritarian communists. I'm an anti-authoritarian. So we already don't agree on that, but we're both kind of far left, like you said. But then I hear them talk about who they're like, Putin this, and I'm like, whoa.
Putin's philosophical supporters in Russia are Bolshevists. He has unreconstructed old school Stalinist type Bolshevists among his intellectual elite establishment. And they are overtly right-wing Bolshevists. So they're practicing a contemporary form of Stalinism, Leninism that aligns explicitly with Trump, that sees Trump as a useful idiot, that wants the Trump wing of the United States establishment to become ascendant. You know what I mean? It's like, so in other words, they see the American far right as a piece of what is fundamentally, from their perspective, a form of communist authoritarianism, just one that is not a left-wing form of communist authoritarianism.
Well, that's always confused me.
Communist right.
Yeah. That's good that you bring that up, because it's always really confused me. I asked Corey before, what the heck is it with them liking Russia with Putin?
Yeah, I mean, it's because they're not smart. It's the lack. It's the lack of intellectual honesty. It comes from a desire to just feel a certain way and to win. Everyone wants to be on the winning side, and if you think your team stands a better chance of winning if you do this or that, people throw out, and you can see movements do this all the time. Realignments happen in this complicated, messy way. It's normal for political movements to do this. You can see every major political movement of the last 200 years has gone through these 50 to 60 year inversion processes. You can talk about the civil rights movement. You can talk about the abolitionists becoming state capitalists. You know what I mean? You can, like the center of the Republican Party in the 19th century was center left. And then in the early 20th century, it moved to the center right. And it did so gradually, where people just didn't, right? Like the same, like people who are right-wing politicians today, they didn't line up on your little 4-quadrant thing. Their position on that has shifted over decades, right?
Well, I think a lot of people do move.
Yeah, right. So
for me personally, I don't think that the graft is wrong. I think that people's beliefs, and I think that's an interesting thought, that people sometimes have two contrary beliefs. So maybe they would be 2 spots to me on the chart. But anyways, I don't care that much about talking about the chart.
We're gonna get off of it. We're getting distracted.
I do appreciate you bringing that stuff up, because I was trying to show why this is important. Why do we need to talk about this stupid Nazis?
So let me get what I was saying. Don't be too locked into the horseshoe thing. But we're going to talk about a phenomenon where Nazi archaeologists or Nazi pseudo-archaeologists have reinvented themselves as leftists and repackaged themselves, and they put on the skin of hippies, right? They get the flower beads and the tie dyes. And they've actually successfully conned a number of very influential and powerful voices in the counterculture. And this has gone back for decades. This has been going on since the 70s, right? Like literally, there has been a Nazi mole in the left-wing counterculture since the late 70s. There have been multiple examples of this. And so we're not going to be comprehensive. We're not going to talk about all the different versions, but that's And by the way, I'm also skeptic. I also don't believe in Atlantis, but I was raised by hippies. I was somebody who knew a lot of people, of left-wing Atlantis supporters. And I was also, as a young person, I was definitely more open to what we call pseudo-archaeology or alternative archaeology perspectives. Once I became educated, I lost most of that, right? I still have a couple little closet sympathies with a couple of arguments, but for the most part, my worldview has shifted as I've gotten older. But
could you go ahead and tell us if you feel comfortable? I don't feel like I have any, but
I'm an agnostic, but I kind of always have been. I've never really had a strong sectarian commitment. But I'm an open-minded agnostic that I like to play with a lot of different ideas. So I've never been married to a perspective. So when I was early in my career, I was really interested in these avant-garde ideas, and it was through exploring them that I realized the problems in most of them. And so I still have no ill will towards people in that community. I really want to have an open dialogue with new age, alternative spiritual people, but I want to also raise a red flag to the need to police these boundaries. Let's cite the punks. Punks in the 80s knew they had a skinhead problem. Early punks in the 70s and 80s knew they had neo-Nazi skinhead problem because they dressed alike, they had the same hairstyle, the same fashion sense, and and weird esoteric tattoos are hard to interpret. If you don't know that something's a white supremacist body art, you'll just whatever, you won't notice it. So they made a decision, the left-wing punks made a decision early on to have a zero tolerance policy. And there was if you were a neo-Nazi skinhead and you went into a bar and ordered a beer, you'd get your ass kicked and you get thrown out on the street, you get your curb stomped, because that was the only way the left-wing punks could ensure that there was no safe haven for neo-Nazi skinheads. And that resulted in the, the fact that to this day, right, there is still no, anti-fascists, right, are serious about this stuff. Unfortunately, the hippies were always more live and let live, right? Like the hippie wing. So
Right.
this is a different counterculture wing. They were always more like, people can transform, people can change, right? You can wake up one morning and stop being a Nazi, and you can embrace your inner child, and you can grow into this, you know what I mean? So this is something that allowed like this idea of a reforming of the reforming of formerly right-wing extremists. So there's two different perspectives here in the left-wing counterculture, we'll say.
Well, I think for me, I was a rightist.
Right.
I was a Christian. I hated gays. I thought the only men and women, all kinds of nonsense. I thought the earth was, I don't know if I wouldn't say I thought the earth was 6,000 years old, but I thought science was an error. There's
right.
Not higher power. What do they call it? Intelligent design. I like that idea more than creationism in a sense, proper, even though they're really both the same. But so I went from that, and when I went to school to be a drug and alcohol counselor and also counsel delinquent youth, because I was also that. So I had this sympathy, both being a drug addict and delinquent youth. I wanted to help people because I realized my life was fucked up. Oh, you know what? A good thing I can come from that is I try to help people change. So I do think you can change. So, but I'm absolutely not hippie about it, because I'm also an anti-fascist. And I believe that you need to change because you're wrong. And if you're interested, here's a video or here's some information. But I don't debate fascists.
Right. But here's what I'm going to say. I also believe in people can change, and I haven't become estranged from my hippie roots. I have many very close friends and loved ones, and I always feel comfortable with crunchy granola people, right? I'm not trying to say that the hippies need to fundamentally alter who they are, but they need to be suspicious of the wolf in sheep's clothing, the people who represent themselves as allies of the far left, but they actually have like this, anti-Semitism and this like strong, like old school, unreconstructed Nazi core ideology and core values. And these,
I agree with you about anti-Semitism. I've actually called out a friend who was a communist, and it was saying this stuff about Jews in Israel. And I said, there's a big difference between I don't like the government and I'm against Jews as people.
Right. Yeah, and I do not want to go down the like contempt. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on the Israel-Palestine front right now, and I'm not. And we're gonna not touch that with a 10-foot.
Yeah, I was just telling you my circumstance that agreed with you. That's all. I was just
and I'm not judging anyone for their personal views on this. And I do agree with you. There's absolutely a huge difference between. So when I talk about anti-Semitism in this thing, I'm talking about people who have a idea of a racialized notion of Judaism. People who real unambiguous. There's a lot of gray area here. There's a lot of like edge cases we could talk about forever. We're not going to talk about the edge cases. We're going to talk about people who believe that Jews are a distinct biological race that is inferior to the white people who we call Aryans. So we're talking about old school.
And I've actually met Jewish people that think they're superior because they're Ashkenazi.
Oh, yeah.
Ashkenazis have higher intellect. And I'm like, that doesn't mean you do.
No, and those kinds of studies are very suspect. Those most like biological anthropologists do not have any regard for those sort of like race and intellect kind of arguments. Yeah. Those are based on really shoddy. They're fundamentally flawed from a statistical point of view. They don't have any merit, broader merit scientifically, and they.
I wasn't agreeing with you. I was saying I challenged him, So I was just saying I know there's both sides, but yes, there's absolutely a problem in the left.
Those are indeed the kinds of pseudoscientific arguments that are used today by neo-Nazis. I mean, whether you regard like the one category of Jew as an exception or not, like these Jews are the good Jews or the racially pure Jews, and those Jews are bad. It's the same kind of argument. There's all kinds of ways that neo-Nazism has tried to reform itself in the post-war era, or characterize itself as something less evil than it used to be, right? Like retain some of the same ideas, but like repackage them, or, redefine them, draw the lines in different places, try to expand, you know what I mean? Like, so in other words, we're living in an era when people who are intellectually bedfellows of mid 20th century European fascists, but they do so with like people of color as their spokespeople, right? Like they put people in, like, think about like, people who are not white Aryan people, but who are now the front face of the movement that was really about promoting, white pride and stuff like that, but doing it from, so we're not racist. Look, we've got a black leader, that kind of thing. See what I mean? It's
but
like,
of course, the black person's that they talks racist. Like
that's right.
Trump
What they really are
is want to own slaves. So like,
right. Yeah, exactly. These kinds of things, but it muddies the water, and it gives them cover, because if you've got this sort of like, if it's people are really simplistic about this argument. I can't be racist if I have a black friend, or I can't be a Nazi if I have a Jewish ancestor. There's so many like people who are self-hating. They're members of a certain constituency, but they want approval from this other group over here, and they're willing to throw their fellow members of their, discriminated against minority group. They're willing to like push them aside so they can join the cool group of edgy rebels with the, that make people uncomfortable and all that. Okay, so let's get to archaeology here. So I saw you were interested in my I wear a lot of hats.
Very interesting,
literally and figuratively. I'm known for wearing hats in class and stuff. And so I have I'm really broadly trained. I'm working as a classical archaeologist now, but my much of my career was about some of this Dene Yeniseian stuff that you're interested in. So we're not covering that really now.
No, but I'm just saying I'd like to have it back on, because
down
that to me
the
is
road,
way more. Whenever
down
you're
the road. When I'm busy for the next few weeks, I'm definitely busy, but we can maybe do some.
No problem. I'm just saying to you that I am 100% more interested in doing that with you than I am about talking about Nazis.
Oh yeah.
I saw that and I'm like, whoa.
Okay. So someday we'll get to that. All right. So now I've sent you. Would you prefer to display the PowerPoint from your end, Corey, or do you want to have me share on my end?
It's probably easier if you're able to do it from your end. I don't know how. I've never done that, but because it's your presentation, that way but I can do it if there's no other way.
All right, so let's see if we can get it. Oh, that's the wrong tab. I'm sorry, I got too many tabs open. I'm that kind of guy. So let's see here. How does it work in StreamYard for me to share my screen?
Do you have a at the bottom
is it the one that says present?
StreamYard? Yeah, is there one there that says
yes, there's one that says present. Okay, so slides and PDFs, boom. I have no slides, so it's because it's using Google Slides there. Let's see, my computer. Let's try that. We currently support Google Slides, PowerPoint, and PDF. Okay, so let me upload the PowerPoint file that way.
Okay.
Directly to screen share and see if that works, or slide, to whatever StreamYard.
Yeah.
Okay. Boom. Zoom. All right. Is it? Oh, it says processing. So it's got a lot of pictures in it. So let's see.
Right on.
All right.
But yeah, so I sent those to you just to show you that what I'm interested in, because I'm interested in the DNA, the language. I'm interested in the migrations.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what they did as agriculture or horticulture or, aquaculture or, any sort of hunter-gatherer, like how they're interacting with their environment. All that interests me.
So Corey, he's talking about my research into a major Native American language family that has a historical relationship with folks in Central Siberia. And so this is a big deal because in the past, they thought these kinds of relationships were all from the Pleistocene. And this is one where I'm interested in stuff that's much more recent than that. So we're talking about before Columbus, but we're talking about population movements in the circumpolar north that would have been from the last few thousand years. And so I favor a kind of a more world historical paradigm for stuff going on in the Western Hemisphere in what we call late prehistory in North America was actually not on a different planet than what was going on in Eurasia, but that Eurasia and the Americas were Eurasia and the Americas were like part of a continuum, a cultural continuum, and that the two so that a lot of what's going on in the ancient world has impacts in the uncontacted Western world, and that the ideology of the idea of discovering this place and the white people show up and it's this pristine place that's never been touched. No, actually it was part of a broader world historical continuum that connects to Asia, but not in the way that these hyper diffusionist pseudo-archaeologists argue. So I'm not saying
totally
that
agree.
the Minoans were mining copper in Michigan. It's more like the Japanese were trading knives with Eskimos. It's more like that. It was you know what I mean? It's like the North Pacific Rim is one region. It's not, whether you're on one side of Bering Strait or another doesn't change the fact that the people indigenous to the North Pacific Rim are one giant world system. And so that explains why there's so things that happened 3,000 years ago in Asia can impact things going on in North America because of the fact that they're never isolated. They're never separated from each other. So that's what
totally
we'll
agree.
talk about. All right. So now it's loaded up. Let's see. So this is a meme that was shared on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. It's just Twitter for me. This is a meme that was shared on Twitter. And so I thought it was a good one to introduce the topic. Because every Gen X archaeologist owes a little bit of their, interest in the discipline to watching the Indiana Jones movies in the 80s. And Indiana Jones got a lot of things wrong, right? We recognize that he's not really a good archaeologist, but he is a good Nazi puncher. So I think that, and the movies did correctly show that the Nazis were in fact the bad guys and not the good guys. And some people are confused about that these days, and that's a problem.
It is.
All right. So let's talk about, so the alignment of that slide is a little off. Some of my graphics are overlapping funny here. And it's probably because it's not PowerPoint that's displaying the slide. But it's fine. It's good enough. We'll let it go. So there's an article on a blog by who was then a graduate student, Matthew Gildner. In 2013, he wrote an article about Atlantis and scientific racism that I'm quoting a couple of pithy quotes. And he's basically talking about this thing called polygenesis. So in the 19th century, early biological anthropology was very racist. Early biological anthropology, they thought that the different races, white people, black people, Native Americans, and Asian people, all had separate biological origins. Like they evolved from separate primate species. That was in a nutshell.
Primates.
Yeah,
oh wow.
19th century polygenism, which is it's like scientific racism in the think about the U.S. Civil War Reconstruction era. Right, this would have been the prior to the Jim Crow laws and all that. So it's after, it's also leading up to the Civil War a little bit. So it's late 19th century academic racism. Darwin comes along, publishes Origin of the Species. So social Darwinism is related to this. The notion that different races have different evolutionary histories and they're distinct branches of humanity with non-identical, non-equivalent ancestors, and that so this is something that's really insidious, and it gets done away with really quickly by American anthropology in the early 20th century. Good. So like Franz Boas, early 20th century American anthropologists basically annihilate this perspective through rigorous empirical analysis of actual biological evidence. They say, wow, these so-called races are barely noticeable, right? You don't have there's no meaningful differences between so-called races. They're closer to each other than individual members of the so-called races. So in other words, me as a white person and you as a white person, we could be more different from each other than either one of us is from a randomly selected non-white person. See what I mean? Yeah, so it's like, in other words, that the internal variation in so-called races is greater than the between race variation. So it's like what the reality is, it's like we're all peanut M&Ms. Some of us are peanut M&Ms. Some of us are chocolate M&Ms. We all have different colors. They're all mixed together in the same bowl. You don't know. I mean, we can tell by the size. So ignore my example. You don't know what's inside the M&M until you eat it. Right. The color on the outside of the M&M is not correlated between the content of you know what I mean? And so we have basically a mixed bowl of M&Ms that look different. And if you sort them into green and yellow and brown, you're not actually sorting them by the meaningful variables there. That the things that the biological differences between humans are significant, but they're below the surface and they don't correspond to the race concept. The race concept is too nebulous and too fuzzy, and it has too many blurry edges. And so that all these so-called races, they actually merge with each other in ways that, and they have forever, right? This isn't last Tuesday. This isn't because of miscegenation or something, because people started race mixing and diluting their pure ancestor races. No, the fact is this has always been the case. This has been the case since before language was written down, right? This is the case going back to early Homo sapiens time. We've always been gregarious assimilators of other people. We've always intermarried with people not like our own group. And this has meant that gene flow has been high. So to put it in a nutshell, we'll say that the most remote and isolated Eskimo population or Inuit population in the circumpolar north is more closely related to somebody in a sub-Saharan African jungle than two different gorilla populations are to each other in Zaire, or in Democratic Republic of Congo. You can find two different gorillas in Democratic Republic of Congo today that haven't interbred with each other for close to 1 million years. So those two different gorillas they look identical, but they're very genetically distinct from each other. Whereas all humans on this planet are cousins. No matter how different you look. So we're more like cats. We're where a litter of cats can have a bunch of different colored kittens, right? Humans are more like cats. You can have siblings classified in different so-called races. Your older brother people can think of them as a black person while they think of you as a white person just because of how you look. You have the same parents, the same grandparents, right? There's even twins in England, famous twins in England, where one's blonde-haired and blue-eyed, one's dark-haired, kinky-haired, dark-skinned twin girls. And they model and they oh, look, a black girl and a white girl, and they're twins. This is all proof that the race concept is socially constructed. It is not biologically meaningful. It is literally skin deep.
For sure.
So I appreciate you addressing that. I addressed that in probably 50% of my videos almost.
Right.
I mean, because I feel racism is just a cancer and has to be addressed and attacked every time possible.
So the way that Atlantis comes into this is, again, a lot of people were into Atlantis, a lot of people of all different political stripes, and not everyone who's into Atlantis was thinking about it in terms of it being the key to understanding races. But one way Atlantis dovetailed with that 19th century polygenism, which is, again, it's happening when ethnic cleansing is happening. They're doing it by measuring the skulls of war dead in the Indian Wars. So they're going in there the museums are gathering battlefield killed Native Americans and defleshing their bodies and sending them into the basements of museums where their bones are then being studied and used to support scientific racism. So this is really horrible stuff. But one of the ways that the idea of Atlantis plays into this is it gives you a separate Garden of Eden. So you have, in other words, people who believed in Lemuria, Atlantis, and other continents. They were saying, now everyone, you've got these separate lost continents where separate races evolved on each of them. So you can have like Aryans, white people coming from the technologically advanced civilization of Atlantis. And then you have black people evolving in Africa. You see what I mean? You have Asian people evolving in Lemuria.
What's Lemuria? I think I've heard that before, but I don't remember what. Isn't that from another mythology thing?
It's another one. It's not mythological. It actually comes out of 19th century bad science. It was not terrible science at the time. So before they proved continental drift, they recognized there were lemur fossils in South Asia and in Madagascar. So they said, oh, wow, you got Madagascar lemur fossils. You got lemur fossils in the Indian subcontinent. How do you explain these? Same species, totally different places. So they noticed this, and then before they had the idea of continental drift, which explains that. So when you had back at the time of the dinosaurs, the continents were a lot closer to each other. So you have like early mammalian expansion out of where species evolved. They can like island hop. They can ride like rafts full of dead wood. So you can get from Madagascar to the Indian subcontinent, which is really recent. Like the Indian subcontinent just smashed into Asia and made the Himalayan plateau. Like, I don't know, I forget, less than 50 million years ago. So you're going back to like the time of the dinosaurs. That hadn't happened yet. So you have all these lemurs on the Indian subcontinent and lemurs in Madagascar because they're like next door neighbors. So we know that now, but at the time they're like, how do you get across this vast ocean? They made up the continent of Lemuria, named after the lemur fossils.
Oh,
and that became the Asian twin of Atlantis. So esoteric mystics then said, now you don't just have one lost continent, you have two. And you can see them as like yin and yang, like polar opposites. So everything bad about this group, you can explain by the Lemurians, or everything good about this group, explained by. So like they would say like that, Asian people are sexually impotent, right? Because Lemurians were like sexually impotent or whatever, that kind of thing. These kinds of really, really racist arguments where you could sort the characteristics into these different primordial founding populations. So polygenism was very closely linked to both of these continents, and to scientific racism at the time. And so early esoteric right-wing Nazism had treated Atlantis kind of like a private Aryan Garden of Eden, a place where the Aryans evolved separate from the mud peoples, these inferior strains, inferior breeds of humanity that came from other continents. Got it?
Yeah.
All right. So that's essentially, so that's why there's a saying, not everyone who believes in Atlantis is a Nazi. There's plenty of Atlantis worshipers on the left. It's huge in the 60s and 70s. A lot of hippies, like people I know and care about in this category. I'm not disparaging all Atlantis believers, but almost all Nazis believe in Atlantis. Unless they're like, unless they're the kind of Nazi that rejects neo-paganism entirely. So like, right-wing neo-pagans, Nazism is kind of like right-wing neo-pagan Nazi, so non-Christian form of Nazism would see Atlantis almost as like an article of faith, like a piece of, like, you see what I mean? Like the way you can't be a Nazi, a neo-pagan Nazi, and not believe in Atlantis. Atlantis is too central to the intellectual movement, and it goes back to its roots at the turn of the last century, like early 20th century, the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. That's when these ideas were getting formulated. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So have you heard of Theosophy and Helena Blavatsky? Do you know who she is, Damien? Or
lightly, because I'm, as you, I don't know, John seems to be very into pseudo-archaeology. I've addressed it more because I was looking for real stuff, and people kept saying, "Oh, that sounds like this person or that person," and so I started realizing. But like I told John, it wasn't until I had an atheist and a leftist tell me we can't trust science, in a sense, because Graham Hancock and this kind of stuff, and that is when I went, "Whoa, I need to address this because I'm pro-science, and this I don't want people to misunderstand not only me, but that science is good. Archaeology is doing good stuff. What the fuck are you talking about?"
So pseudo-archaeology, you have to understand the history of Western esoteric mysticism. So this is not science anymore. We're down into religion again, but we're not in Christianity. We're in Western esoteric mysticism, which in the 19th century, again, the right-left spectrum was different then. So in the 19th and 20th century, what we now call right wasn't where the right is today, right? Like the left-wing, right-wing spectrum aligned very differently in terms of cultural war issues. So believe it or not, political Christianity in the Civil War era in the United States, late 19th century, political Christianity was left-wing. It was like abolitionism. It was political Christianity in the late 19th century was about ending slavery. And eventually it also became about like alcohol prohibition. And so you can see the realignment. It changes in the 20th century after prohibition. It's no longer the same way. But in the last few decades of the 19th century, political Christianity was left-wing, but neo-paganism in the same period wasn't entirely right-wing, but it was much more right-wing than it is later. So you can see esoteric mysticism in the 19th century as on a political spectrum that was definitely not to the left of Christianity at the time. That makes sense. It was in this more center right. And so you have and there was a left wing of neo-paganism in the 19th century, but it wasn't far left. It was like a center. It was more middle of the road, ironically, because it was people who were interested in restoring to a lost kind of European civilization that was before Christianity, right? They're looking for and so Helena Blavatsky, she, in her book, The Secret Doctrine, which is like the foundational text of theosophy. And by the way, the Theosophy archives were burned to the ground recently in the wildfires in California. So that's unfortunate for the history of Western esoteric mysticism. Many of the primary source documents for this religious movement were lost. But she is basically arguing that that ghosts of Atlanteans can speak through like trance mediums. So essentially, like you can go into a state of trance, like where your mind and your body become dissociated, and then you start speaking with the ghost of a 10,000-year-old dead Atlantean, right? And so she's channeling essentially the original religion of Atlantis, and she's talking about Lemuria and stuff too, because that's all contemporary ideas. So Atlantis and Lemuria and all this stuff coming through the secret doctrine. And so many of our ideas about Atlantis come not from ancient Plato, but from modern mystical embellishments. Like Plato doesn't say Atlantis was technologically advanced. Plato says Atlantis was a militarily advanced, empire. It was an ancient empire that fought a war with Athens. But all that stuff about like Atlantis having high technology and stuff, none of that is from ancient sources, because they didn't know what high technology was in Plato's time. There was no like concept of like deities or, magical contraptions. Yeah, the gods were involved. The gods can do supernatural stuff, but there's no technologically advanced Atlantean civilization in classical sources. That comes from modern sources, like Blavatsky. Blavatsky, Francis Bacon, and others. The myth of Atlantis is a modern myth that gets developed with the idea of these technological super race in Atlantis. And she talks about the root races of humanity, right? Like these original root races. And so she's not necessarily herself far right wing, but you can see where far right wing Atlantis groups get their impetus from. If she says that the original root race of Atlantis was Aryan, right? So you start to get the idea, the connection of the origin of the Aryan peoples, white peoples in Atlantis. It comes from theosophy and from her movement. She also was anti-drugs, by the way. Good for her there, I guess. She said that the Atlanteans destroyed their brains from overuse of psychic power, and she said that hallucinogens could access the astral plane, and you could learn about Atlantis by tripping on powerful psychotropic drugs, but that this would quickly burn out your higher consciousness. Like you'd be able to you get this like temporary access to the lower levels of your initiation, but then eventually what would happen is you'd be like a crispy critter. You'd be done. And so she was.
Doesn't Graham Hancock kind of say the same thing, that he thinks that you should take hallucinogens to go to other worlds?
Lots of psychedelic people, lots of psychedelics involved, and also in the late left wing, right? The turn on, tune in, drop out. You can think of late 60s hippies taking powerful drugs, accessing the astral plane. Lots of what's written about Atlantis and other kinds of, alternative spiritualities intersection with fringe archaeology comes from drug use. Drug use directly inspires it. It's like you can access hidden parts of your consciousness, and people start to take that literally. If I hallucinated, it must be true, right? And therefore, I went and got this. Jesus took me on an expedition to Orion's Belt, and when I was in Orion's Belt, I saw the Galactic Command Center for Universal Consciousness that controls the pyramids, right? Allows time travel to occur, right? I went back and I met the priest that talked to Plato. He confirmed that Plato wasn't lying about Atlantis. It's true, right? See what I mean? So this is all quite, And you can see why this comes back in the 60s among people who were maybe less, critical thinking skills were not as far advanced as they should be. All right, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the division in early esoteric mysticism between the right wing and the left wing. So I don't know if you've ever heard of like Waldorf education. Have you ever heard of it's a paradigm?
No, I've never seen this symbol, and I did not know there was a left wing, right wing thing. So
so
I barely knew the word theosophy.
Theosophy is Blavatsky's movement. And so it's Western esoteric mysticism. It's like late 19th century, early 20th century neo-paganism, right? And in Europe, European neo-paganism, late 19th, early 20th centuryism. And it gives rise to the neo-pagan wing of Nazism, right? Neo-pagan Nazism is the far right wing of theosophy from the interwar period. The intellectual clubs, the clubs of European elite, like social clubs and secret societies, think like Freemasonry and crap like that, where you get in these social orders that are not explicitly Christian. They may have some trappings of Christianity, but mostly it's about finding the original European, right, super culture or whatever. And so you have the right wing of neo-paganism in the late 19th and early 20th century, going into the period between World War I and World War II, when it really grows and blossoms. And that is the one that we think of, we call it like Ariosophy, is the right wing of like Aryan theosophy, the far right wing of theosophy. And that's where the Hitler's archaeology stuff comes from.
Okay.
Now, there was also a kind of a center left wing of theosophy, and we sometimes call that anthroposophy, right? Anthroposophy is associated with Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner was a theosophist, but he was more of a moderate theosophist. He rejects some of the wackier claims, like they thought they found a Messiah in India, and Steiner was like, nah, he's not the Messiah, right? So like there were these different like sects within theosophy. And so anthroposophy was originally opposed to Hitler. It was, and so Hitler actually blackballed the anthroposophists. During the period of Hitler's rise to power, Steiner opposed him, and so Hitler condemned Steiner. Hitler said Steiner is out, and so Steiner's followers were officially persecuted by the early like intellectual forebears of the Nazis. But then what happened is Steiner, who was an old man, he died in the mid-20s, and unfortunately, what happened is the remaining anthroposophists, including Steiner's wife, they capitulated. They said, "Oh, we're good Aryans," right? In other words, so what happened is in the period leading directly up to World War II, you lose that left wing of European theosophy. In the mainstream of theosophy, you have overt alignment with the far right and with fascism. You see what I mean? There's no, because you can no longer, I mean, they did it out of self-preservation.
Yeah.
Not saying that it wasn't coerced, but it was really bad to be Jewish, right? Because now not even the, like, Steiner wasn't like the best ally, but at least he was like, no, it's not okay for, you know, the Jews to be rounded up and killed. And so now you have what? The remainder of his organization is now like on Team Hitler. And so, but I will say, like, modern Waldorf education, also organic biodynamic agriculture. So if you want to find modern followers of Steiner, go to France and look for organic winemaking in France. Like, go find someone who's using like the most serious forms of biodynamic agriculture. I guarantee you they're Steinerian, right? They're coming out of a branch of anthroposophy that was interested in agriculture and stuff like that. So yeah, so there is still, so Steiner's wing still exists. It is not Nazi, but you can see that the theosophy symbols here, which combine all these different religious symbols, so they appropriated the swastika from Indian religion, from Hinduism and Buddhism. They plugged it in along with the Star of David, the Ankh, the Tau cross, the Om. See that symbol with the snake and the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, right? So they're basically making a mashup of all the religions of the world. And they're saying all these religions are one, and that like theosophy is the original human religion of Atlantis, you know, from that way back when. So you see how, so where did the Nazis get their swastika from? The swastika was being used by theosophists before it was being used by Nazis. Why did the Nazis pick the swastika as their symbol? Because of its Aryan associations, but also because of its theosophy associations. It wasn't, you know what I mean? The Nazis were, now Hitler himself wasn't really, he was kind of not super aligned with the weird mystics in his movement, but the people around Hitler were. So Hitler kind of was more of a skeptic personally. He didn't like buy into as much of that, like as an individual, but he promoted people, like his inner circle included a lot of like cultists, people who believed in this stuff really strongly. Okay.
Well, yeah, and I think that I can see where even like Trump is not a Christian, but yet he says he champions Christian causes as if he's a Christian. Trump.
Say again. I can't hear you.
I was saying Trump.
Oh, yeah. I know.
Yeah, so Trump acts Christian or says he's going to defend Christians, but he himself doesn't even know the Bible.
Yeah. So that, as an analogy, I don't want to get let's stay away from contemporary politics, but yeah, you're right. You're right about that. I mean, it's so awful to think about. I don't want to go there.
Yeah, I wasn't saying good. I was just using it as an example.
Yeah. People in the head of a movement.
You could promote people and yet not agree with them.
Right. And there was a lot of like Nazi Christianity under the Third Reich would classify it as a Christian heresy today because it was literally subordinating Christ to Nazism. Right? Like they would put the swastika in front of the Christian, you know what I mean? In other words, so if you were a mainstream Christian who capitulated and joined the Nazi movement, you basically were overtly okay with having an Aryan God that was like not a Jewish God, right? See what I mean? So you have like fundamental elements of Christianity in Third Reich Europe were compromised, right? The form of official Christianity under Nazism was not. It was sort of like you could also draw parallels to the contemporary movement, where who does your loyalty to? Is your loyalty to the leader or to the religion? It has to be first to the leader and second to the religion. The religion can't be more important than the guy who's the head of the fascist government. Right. You lost Corey. Is Corey?
He might have done something real quick. He has kids.
Okay. All right. Oh yeah, I know what that's like. I've done podcasts with kids in the background before. All right. So next slide.
Once in a while, the kids come in and he has to go, hey, no.
So I got a couple of recommended readings here for people who are interested in this topic. Goodrich Clark's 1985 book, The Occult Roots of Nazism, The Ariosophists of Austria and Germany, 1890 to 1935. So this is the kind of seminal historical account. It's also based on his 82 PhD dissertation, which has the same, like subtitle as the book. That's also another source. And then Heather Pringle's 2006 book, The Master Plan, also deals with this stuff really importantly. So
and the one that's 1985, those kind of look like ruins, but then kind of not. I don't know all the ruins.
Right. And yeah, I'm not like I'm not like the symbologist in the Da Vinci Code. I'm not like somebody who can instantly tell you those are indeed symbols of Western esoteric occult mysticism. You see the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail there, which we saw already in the earlier. So these Ariosophists are taking that theosophy seed and growing it into a tree that is Hitlerism, right? Like Hitler is their cult leader for them, right? He may not be serious, he may not take it seriously himself, but he's happy to be the figurehead for it from the rank and file right-wing neo-pagans of that.
And would you say he did it because it promotes Germany's greatness or Aryan greatness?
Yeah, exactly. Because they're trying to demote, the Jewish peasant that was being worshipped by a bunch of white people were worshiping this Jewish peasant, and they didn't really like that. They would rather have, a white god for white people. And so there's different ways to solve this problem. Like Christian identity movement is one where they say Jesus wasn't a Jew. Like the Christian identity Nazis, they're like Christian fundamentalists, except for they don't believe in the Jewishness of Jesus. They believe that Jesus was like anti-Jewish fundamentally from the beginning, which is obviously historically false. But if you invent a white Jesus who hates Jewish people, then you can worship Jesus and still be a good Nazi. That kind of thing is, you know what I mean?
Bizarre. Jesus had that. Remember when Jesus supposedly helps the child of the woman who's not Jewish? The whole end of the thing is the beginning of the thing, he says, "I have come here for the children of Israel," or something like that, right?
Right. Yeah. So early, and then she's a Samaritan. That's the woman at the well, right? Yeah. There's a lot of the history of Christian anti-Judaism is really complicated, and it goes back to the earliest documents that we have, which are 1st and 2nd century documents. So that's a really interesting and complicated topic. How does a Jewish sect become anti-Jewish, which it does over the course, and it goes back to the realignment thing, right? Like it begins as a Jewish sect in the early 1st century, and then by the early 2nd century, 100 years later, it's now an anti-Jewish sect. We can see those same story about these political inversions that happen over decades within a movement as a result of internal factions forming. And so, but we're dealing with the aftermath of that 2,000 years later now, which is a very different, the political circumstances of the early Christians are not the ones we're talking about now. So, so Heather Pringle's book, exactly, is another one. The point is that you get the state sponsorship of Aryan archaeology, and most of these Aryan archaeologists were anti-Christian. So they weren't like about promoting a white Christianity. There are those in the movement who do that, but these are right-wing neo-pagans for the most part. And so Himmler's SS and Honornube is the Honornube is like one of the major anthropology organizations of the Third Reich. And it's not the only one. There are factions in the German academy in the period we're talking about. So during World War II, there are other archaeologists that are that are in Germany, that are members of the Nazi Party, who are not in the Honornube. And the Honornube was like infighting. It had rivalries, with different, organizations. But because of the power of the SS and Himmler, it's one of the most prominent and most politically significant. Think of it as look, I told you I didn't want to talk about contemporary politics, but look at the infighting that's going on right now between Marco Rubio and Elon Musk. They're fighting over the mandate and how they're all like going at the government with like pruning shears and hacking at the administrative state. But the State Department under Rubio wants to protect certain pieces of the administrative state that Elon Musk wants to annihilate, right? And so that's the infighting between two different members of the Trump cabinet is going on now. So you had similar things like that in Nazi archaeology, where you had powerful, well-placed honor newbie members that had old grudges against colleagues in different departments and stuff like that. So it's messy and it's complicated. And I don't want to present the honor noob like it's the monolithically, like all Nazi anthropologists, all archaeologists were aligned with theosophy, but many of them were, and the ones in the honor noob were. It was like the vanguard of pseudo-archaeology under the Nazis. And they did things like there were people who were associated with them in various countries. I forgot, I didn't include the slide, but there was one of them who's a biological anthropologist, a Swiss-French biological anthropologist, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of them, who were looking for the lost race of monkeys in South America that evolved into Native Americans. And they had the famous cryptozoological hoax. It's called Deloy's ape. Deloy's ape is like they found a howler monkey, a large female howler monkey, and they cut off her tail and they propped her up on a stick and they pretended that she was the evolutionary ancestor of Native Americans. And they published these people were promoted as, in Nazi occupied France. They pushed these anthropological arguments, and the guy who promoted it, he got killed by the resistance at the end of the war. The French resistance killed him, so he didn't continue pushing this stuff after the war. But yeah, so the honor noob were into a lot of shady kinds of pseudo-archaeology. And so Herman Werth is the guy we're going to talk about. He was a Dutch prehistorian, and he promoted the idea of the Thule Society. He believed that there was a North Atlantic Atlantis that was the source of all Aryan people. So like you go up off the coast of Scandinavia and he believed that
you mean something up there? Yeah, I get it.
So he believed that his location for Atlantis was way up in the North Atlantic, and he believed that pictographs, petroglyphs, and runes that were carved in like ancient Finland on rocks, he believed that was the origination of language millions of years ago. He believed that, he believed that the first written language was done in the greater Nordic cultural area by prehistoric Norse people that came out of Atlantis up in the North Atlantic. And that's like
aren't the pictographs in Finland like 4,500 and under?
Yeah, of course, but they didn't have good dating, and it's really hard to date rock art anyway. Rock art is always hard to date. You got to date it by contextual clues. So if you have an occupied site with like charcoal, like physical evidence of human habitation in the site, you can use that evidence to infer the date of the rock art. Or if you use like organic pigments in your paint, right? Like you're using like a burnt stick, like your charcoal drawing or whatever, you can find enough organic residue to date it. But if you're scratching into a wall with another rock, it's like there's no inherent way that you can tell how old that is. So especially back then when they didn't have radiocarbon, they didn't have anything. It was basically just take a stab at it, right? It's like, what do you think, man? Oh, I think it's this old, right? It was much less scientific than it would eventually be.
Don't you feel like that Graham Hancock, at least in my impression, because I haven't done tons of reading him or anything, but just in his shows, it seems like he tries to act like archaeologists think that way. Like they're just making up numbers.
No, they're not. It's the other way around. It's projection. Whenever these pseudo-archaeologists say things like that, they're projecting, and they'll cite examples of archaeologists doing it that are out of date. They'll like deliberately cherry pick old archaeology where like from generations ago, and there's numerous examples of this. They'll say, look here, look at this dumb thing. They want to relitigate controversies of the past like they haven't already been resolved. Right. And by the way, you're a former fundamentalist Christian, are you, Damien?
I was, yes.
So you'll be aware that fundamentalist Christians do the same thing when they're talking about like evolution and stuff. They'll like talk about scholarship from like the 1950s as though it's what current people are currently arguing. And they'll try they'll like highlight like mistakes that were made 100 years ago as evidence against evolution, as though those mistakes haven't already been accounted for in later arguments. So this kind of stuff, pseudo-archaeology.
Because I've actually debated some before, not on a video, but like in public. Just I went to his church and challenged him because he was in my local area and saying that he was going to teach people how science is wrong and creationism is true. And I thought, is it open to the public? Okay, I'm going to go down there. But anyway, but I thought it was ridiculous because he kept saying Darwinism, and I'm like,
right.
You mean the theory of evolution? And we don't call it Darwinism. I mean, I'm just saying.
Yeah, Darwin is a founder of a foundational thinker in terms of understanding natural selection, but he didn't understand it perfectly. We figured it out after he died, right? Like the synthesis of Darwin and Mendel's thinking is one of the beginning impetus of modern evolutionary biology, but it's no more, central to the modern idea than Newton's notes are the central to every people studying orbital mechanics today. Like if you're doing research on the moons of Titan of Jupiter or something, you're not going to need to go consult Newton's notebooks in order to you're doing your own thing based,
that's good.
It's like, anyway, okay, so let's go to, you said we are going to do an hour. I can't do forever, but I can go a little longer. I have a lot more material to cover.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, it's up to Corey. I could go 3 hours. It's up to Corey.
I can't go 3 hours. I got to teach this afternoon.
No, I'm just saying that so I don't have a problem with it. It's
all right. We'll just keep blasting through, and I'll try to. I may end suddenly because I got to switch gears. So when I'm done, I'll be done, and then we'll have to do it again later. All right. Yeah. So Corey, are you in a rush?
I got a little bit of time yet. Another probably 25 minutes.
Yeah, let's do that. I can handle that.
Right on.
All right. So we'll finish when we finish. All right. So Wirth. So this Wirth guy is the first example of somebody I'm going to talk about who reinvents themselves as a counterculture figure. Right. So the Anunnaki includes some real bad guys. There are members of the Anunnaki that are directly involved in war crimes. There are members of the Anunnaki that commits murder-suicide rather than getting caught at the end. We'll cut to those later. These are people that rather than go to jail and face trial at Nuremberg, they just murder their family and themselves because they've been out. Like we're talking about unethical human subjects research here. We're talking about these are anthropologists. They believe that some people are like animals. And, just like you can do testing on animals, you can do testing on people as long as those people are not classified as fully human beings. You classify them as subhuman, and therefore they can be disposed of in your experiments. So Wirth is not he's not directly implicated in war crimes to that degree, but he is one of the co-founders of the organization. He is somebody who was there at its inception. He hung around with those people. He was he was cheek by jowl with them. They were all in it together from the beginning. So he's got a lot of guilt by association. We'll put it that way. But like many Nazis did, unfortunately, the way the war ended, I mean, I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's a fact that they couldn't punish everyone to the degree they probably deserved. And there were lots of ways that people were allowed to denazify themselves. So after Germany lost the war, there were official channels for reform where people who had been collaborators, who had been directly involved in Nazi bullshit, were able to repackage themselves as resistance figures. They would say, I have not been fairly, don't call me a Nazi. I was secretly not a Nazi, right? And so that they were trained literally by people that say, you want to go get a job in the US, you have to rewrite your resume now and say you were secretly not really a Nazi, and then we'll rubber stamp it. Whether you were or not a Nazi or not is less important than how you're able to make the case, right? It's think of it the lawyer arguing for their client to the best degree possible. Whether or not their client is guilty is less important than whether their client can be rehabilitated in the eyes of the jury. It's the jury's opinion, not reality. And so you have this this systematic rehabilitation of Nazi collaborators, especially when the Nazi collaborators have valuable institutional knowledge, academic contributions. So think about like Operation Paperclip. Think about Werner von Braun, these people who were involved in aerospace research during the Cold War. These would be high value assets that the US government would want to turn them into American assets. And so again,
didn't Russia do that as well? I'm not.
Yeah, anyone. So basically, you get the idea. So the reality is there was a lot of people looking the other way when someone had something valuable that they wanted. And it was okay for us to pretend like they weren't really as bad as they were. And so you had this to an extent with some archaeologists, not as much, because archaeology wasn't nearly as valuable as rocket science, but you did have some rehabilitation of, other kinds of academics, including members of the honor noob. And most of the honor noob were not allowed to work officially in academia, but you had, like, Herman Werth reinvented himself as an independent scholar. So he doesn't go and get like a high-ranking university job after the war, but he becomes kind of a wandering folklorist. Here, I'll show you. This is him in his like European folklore attire with his like special instrument. So by the 1970s, he had morphed into an indigenous studies expert. And he actually got people in like Native American studies to kind of take him seriously, again, because he's not wearing his Nazi. He's not saying, I'm a former member of the SS.
Yeah.
I have a lot of blood on my hands. He's not doing that. Remember, he believes that Aryans originate from the far North Atlantic. There's a lot of connection between Aryans and Native Americans, according to some of these Nazi views. Like there are, so like certain groups of Native Americans might be like cousins of the Aryans or Aryans themselves. There's a lot of like right-wing neo-Nazis who believe that certain like Mesoamerican civilizations are Atlanteans. So if you believe the Atlanteans founded high civilizations in other parts of the world, including in the Western Hemisphere, then you might just want to connect the dots between the Aryans and the more civilized groups in the American, what they call civilized, because they have this like paradigm. Like some Native Americans are not Aryans, but others might be. So he represents himself.
I was going to ask, do you think that's why? Because that second installment of Graham Hancock's nonsense, he made a comment that I thought was just outrageous. Anyone critical thinking, I don't know how they could keep believing him, because he's like, I used to say that my people came from somewhere else, but now maybe the Americas. Is that what he means? Because people think that Nazis went over there, or Aryans.
Oh, yeah, not Nazis. So the Aryans
are not Nazis.
Let's be clear about what the Aryans are. The real Aryans, the historical Aryans, were like a class of religious leader in early Brahmanical polytheism. So you go down to like Sanskrit, like ancient Sanskrit literature. The Aryans were like a similar to like Brahmins. They were like it was like a technical term for ceremonial like priestly vocations in the Vedic literature. And so the term gets appropriated by 19th century bullshit artists. Or bullshit artists is too glib. 19th century Western esotericism adopts the word Aryan from the Vedic Sanskrit literature and uses it as a synonym for white people.
Right.
So when we talk about white Aryans in the context of Western esoteric mysticism, we mean white people. In the technical academic sense, Aryans are not white. They're South Asians, right? They would have, if you went back in time and saw a historical Aryan, we have no idea what color skin they would have, what color hair they would have. They could have been dark-skinned, dark-haired people. We don't have, they're not a real historical person we can look at. They're, it's an echo from ancient literature that it's been used as a branding for these, these white people from Atlantis. Yeah. So that's why there's a lot of people who believe like that the Mayans were Aryans. And this is where Hancock gets criticized for using these arguments about white-skinned, red-bearded founders in Mesoamerican religious literature. Those are the same arguments that these people use, right? He's just done it. He's saying, I'm not a Nazi. It just so happens that I'm using the arguments that were pioneered by the Nazis, who were arguing that the Aryans were involved in high civilization in the New World. And so Werth represents him now as an indigenous studies scholar, and he gained some cachet with the emerging counterculture movement in the 70s, right? This is like alternative archaeology as a discipline that we associate with the left-wing hippies in the late 20th century, the people that I grew up around. That's the group, that's the circle that he's trying to insert himself into. And so he becomes he denazifies sort of on the surface, and he's like involved in some museum exhibit plannings and displays. But then Der Spiegel writes an investigative expose among some others. So in other words, the journalists did their job. They had a free press in Germany. He got exposed, and the whole thing got aborted. Right. His ability to kind of have a second career, a late career renaissance, is kind of like this bohemian ethnomusicologist, right? He's like this, you know what I mean? Yeah. He like as this sort of gypsy-like figure, he becomes now ostracized again. And to validate all this, though, he was still actively talking with neo-Nazis then. Right, he gets interviewed in 1979 by a prominent right-wing neo-pagan neo-Nazi in Chile, Miguel Serrano, right, about his research. So he never converted. So, like, in other words, he didn't really transform into a left-wing bohemian, hippie. He just represented himself as that because it was a way for him to maintain a career. So that's just the one example of that. So another recommended reading, there's a new book called Conspiracy Theories and Extremism in New Times, just published last year, edited by Christopher T. Connor, Matthew N. Hanna, and Nicholas J. McMurray. One of the articles in it, one of the chapters in it, chapter 3, published by, I don't know if she has her PhD yet, she was a PhD student at the time, Stephanie Halmhofer. She writes a chapter called Manufacturing History, Atlantis, Aryans, and the Use of Pseudo-archaeology by the Far Right. So this is a current work. She deals with several of the people that I've talked about, or that I will talk about in this article. And this caused Jimmy Corsetti. Do you know Jimmy Corsetti, Bright Insight?
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately I do. He actually banned me before I even commented on him.
Yeah, he used to do that. Now he might have unbanned you. Most of us have been unbanned by him because he realized it made him look hypocritical. So he went and, like, right around New Year's Day, he went and did a mass unbanning. So I'm no longer banned by him, but I don't really interact.
Then I don't know.
You should go check. Maybe you're not banned by him anymore. But Jimmy Corsetti he's outraged that anyone would say that Atlantis had anything to do with the far right. And so he attacks Stephanie Halmhofer for her arguments that these Nazis exist, right? She's writing a purely historical expose here, which is just about facts. And so but evidently, because he feels guilt, he doesn't want guilt by association. So he's like pretending like this is a character assassination of him personally.
He's the one, though, that openly says, "Oh yeah, I take the manacle. I'm a conspiracy theorist." I'm like,
right, exactly. Wow, he does, and so he wants his conspiracy theory to be the good kind, the non-racist kind. He's started to try and distance himself more from the Nazis, but he has a lot of the far right, the really far right wing Atlantis people are in his followers and mentions. You can see them commenting on his posts on social media. So he has done more recently to try and distance himself from those folks, but he needs to do more than that. And he's not done enough, in my opinion, even though he's started. But I think it's really hilarious that he's taking such an offense to her writing this article when she's talking about the same thing that he knows. He's got to know this stuff exists. So let's talk about a couple of examples now. In the last 10 minutes, I'll cite some really famous examples. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon is this guy named Frank Joseph. So Frank Joseph here wrote The Destruction of Atlantis. He wrote this in the 80s. The original edition was like 87 or something. This is the 2004 revised edition. So look who his blurbs are written by. Frank Joseph has got a blurb written by Robert Bauval. Does anyone know who Robert Bauval is? Author of The Orion Mystery and Message of the Sphinx?
No.
Robert Bauval is one of Graham Hancock's more prominent co-authors. Graham Hancock has written multiple books with Robert Bauval, like multiple books in different countries, different editions for different audiences. He's written conspiracy theory books with Graham Hancock. He's written ancient aliens books with Graham Hancock. He's co-authored books about the Sphinx with Graham Hancock. So this is a big name. He's the father of the Orion correlation theory, which is Hancock's notion that the pyramid, the Giza complex its design goes back 10,000 years or 12,000 years Atlantis, because it aligns with Orion's belt, right? The stars in Orion's belt line up with according to these people, which it doesn't, by the way. It doesn't. The stars do not line up with Orion's belt. And they didn't do it 10,000 years ago anyway, but they say it did. That's the whole thing. So he's a big name. Here he is endorsing Joseph's book. The other guy, Robert, I'm disappointed that Robert Hieronymus did. Robert Hieronymus endorsed his book. Robert Hieronymus is a very prominent countercultural figure. Robert Hieronymus designed one of the most famous Woodstock buses. He's one of the major influential historians of Yellow Submarine. So he's like a Beatles historian. He knew personally Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, and like he was somebody who has been like the Woodstock's generation cultural touchstones and artist. He's done really important murals at like major, like Johns Hopkins University, and like he's got and public art. He's like huge. So he's a big deal, like hippie intellectual with a ton of street cred. And he's saying that Frank Joseph's book should be standard issue text in all high school and college history courses.
How ridiculous.
So I'm sorry, Bob, if you're out there, stop. Right? Recognize when you're getting actual Nazis. Oh, the Bear & Company and Inner Traditions are the outfit that published it. These are Magic Crystal publishing companies that push like lots of like herbal medicine, psychedelic shamanism, how to get in touch with different deities through LSD and mushrooms and things like that. Graham Hancock hasn't written for them, but he's written a lot of introductions for their authors. All the Ancient Aliens crowd, they publish with this outfit. Like, so most of like the major Ancient Aliens authors have got books that with them, right? They're like, that's their bread and butter is this stuff, this publication. So they're mainly a hippie press. But this guy is, and he's also friends with Shirley MacLaine. So I've got Shirley MacLaine, I love The Apartment. But as an older woman, The Apartment is a movie with Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. She's a great actor from the golden age of Hollywood. And she becomes a new age luminary, right? Somebody who believes in astral projection and astrology and all that. And so she's close personal friends with Frank Joseph, and she wrote blurbs on his book about synchronicity. So he is connected with people in the counterculture, in the New Age movement in the 90s and 2000s when he was the editor of Ancient American magazine. And who is he? Oh, he's written books on ancient high tech, military encounters with extraterrestrials, how to time travel using the pyramids, right? Advanced. We evolved from dolphins, folks. We evolved from dolphins.
I have heard that theory. Yes.
Yeah.
I've never even heard that.
He's got all the stuff he does, but he's not originally Frank Joseph. He was originally Frank Collin, he wasn't originally Frank Collin. He was originally Frank Cohen or Frank Kahn. All right. Can we press play on this? Let's see. No, it's not. It won't let me play. He's the basis for the Henry Gibson character in the Blues Brothers. Have you seen Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi's Blues Brothers? There's a scene where they're driving through Illinois and there's a neo-Nazi protest going on a bridge. And they say, "I hate Illinois Nazis." And they drive their car over the bridge. They're good Nazi punchers. They drive their car over the bridge and they cause all the American Nazis to jump off the bridge into the water to avoid getting run over by their land yacht, their late 70s rust bucket that they're driving. And so Henry Gibson plays the guy leading the Illinois Nazis in the late 70s. Who was the guy leading the Illinois Nazis in the late 70s? Ding, 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 ding. Frank Joseph, then named Frank Collin. He was like one of the founding members of the American Nazi Party in the late 70s. And the basis for that parody caricature in the Blues Brothers, because he led the Skokie race riots. He was defended by the American Civil Liberties Union, which has always been solidly pro-free speech, right?
Yeah.
He had Jewish lawyers at the ACLU defending him before the Supreme Court, where he won the case for the right to protest, which was, basically to go through Jewish neighborhoods. His original name Khan is because his dad was actually a survivor of Auschwitz, not Auschwitz, Dachau, I think.
Jeez.
So he's actually Jewish himself. His original surname was like a version of Cohen, Khan, right? But he's a self-hating person of Jewish descent who joins the Nazis in the late 70s. He then goes to jail for sex crimes against children. So he spends the early 80s in an Illinois state penitentiary. And during that's when he has a not come to Jesus, we'll say come to Ra moment, or come to one of the, the big pagan deities maybe, because in the 70s, I skipped a slide. I'll go back because we're running out of time. I'll jump back to it in a second. In the late 70s, he goes to this Illinois penitentiary, and there's this weird prison guard named Russ Burroughs. Russ Burroughs is a prison guard, and he's a Korean War veteran and scam artist. And he meets Frank Collin, who would then rename himself Frank Joseph and become a New Age author. He meets him in prison right around the time Raiders of the Lost Ark comes out. He gets out of jail. And then Burroughs discovers this cave full of mysterious artifacts in Illinois, which is not a real cave. It doesn't actually exist, but he says it does. He says he dynamites the entrance to seal it in there. It's basically proof of like ancient transoceanic mariner civilizers coming from like the ancient Mediterranean and setting up. They took like Alexander the Great's mummy and buried it in a tomb in Illinois. Right. So it's a huge rabbit hole. We could just do an entire episode of your podcast, me just talking about the weird shit from Burroughs Cave. And there's a bunch of, there's a bunch of archaeological theft and looting going on there at that time. They're probably involved, right? These guys are involved in some really like shady archaeology crimes in that region in the 80s. And then by the late 80s, they basically are a team where Burroughs makes the artifacts and Frank Joseph promotes them through his scholarship. So Frank Joseph is the editor of Ancient American Magazine and writing books like The Lost Treasure of King Juba and stuff. He's promoting and pushing these ancient artifacts that are just made up as though that they are like, proof of ancient advanced high-tech civilizations crossing oceans and millions of years ago. So this is the picture of Russ Burroughs, this Korean War veteran guy, crawling out of this alleged cave. There aren't any caves in that part of Illinois. That's a rock shelter. That's not even a real cave. Like karst topography, you have to go down into Kentucky to find actual caves. This part of Illinois they call Little Egypt. There's one of these goofy cartoon like unicorn guys here holding an ankh. See that? These mudstone carvings. That does not look like a real artifact to you, does it?
No, it doesn't.
That's like, that's one of the goofier ones that looks like it could have been a Hanna-Barbera character.
That's definitely a cartoon. Yeah, that's right.
But there are some that are better than that, and there are some that are worse than that. I didn't show you any of the pornographic ones, but so this is Russ Burroughs is associated with him, and then of course the History Channel is getting in on this action too. If you look at season 2, episode 5 of America Unearthed, with Scott Woder as the host, you can see those are Burroughs Cave fake gold artifacts that spray painted lead. See that to look like gold bars.
Wow.
My late friend Richard Flavin was aware of an estate sale that had some of these fake gold artifacts that were bequested to someone, and they tried to give them away to Goodwill, but Goodwill couldn't accept it because lead is toxic waste. So they had to dispose of them as toxic waste. So it's sad if you were hoping that you had ancient like Minoan gold bars and you turned out you really had toxic waste.
Yeah,
it's a sad story. And this is a picture of Julius Caesar as an Egyptian pharaoh. It's actually carved on a hunk of colonial gravestone. So like some of these carvings have like, you can look on the backside and see like lettering from like 18th century graveyards, because they use that as the stone to make their fakes.
Wow.
All right. So, and then we're almost out of time, and I do have to go soon. So I'll mention one more, Patrick Chenard. And so I noticed both of these guys are listed as Simon & Schuster publisher writers. Joseph, and Chenard, because that hippie press, Bear and Company Intertraditions, was bought by Simon and Schuster. So they're now a subsidiary of a mainstream publishing organization. So you can see their publisher,
which gives them that fake credibility.
Right. So Patrick Chenard is somebody who was edited by Frank Joseph at Ancient American Magazine on topics related to Burroughs Cave, and he edited a magazine his own called New Archaeology Review. And these are some of his books that are from the Bear and Company Intertradition. So these are his Simon and Schuster books, The Lost Race of the Giants and Forgotten Worlds. Look who writes his introduction, his foreword. The foreword of Frank Chenard's book is written by Robert M. Schock. Do you know who Robert M. Schock is? Either one of you?
No.
Robert M. Schock is the father of the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis.
He's
I know. Graham Hancock's best geology friends. He believes that like the warm Sahara period scoured the Sphinx with jungle rains, right? So he is very, very close, tightly in Graham Hancock's inner circle. And here he's writing the blurb. So we have Balville writing Joseph's blurb. We have Chenard's blurb being written by Schock. So we're showing how many degrees of separation there are between these guys and the big guns in left-wing pseudo-archaeology, right? And now let's look at the newer books by Chenard. These are Chenard's newer books, which come from his Nazi press.
Wow.
The Lost Aryans of Ancient America, Rise of the Aryans. See the black sun symbol there by this Aryan guy?
Yep.
He's got tons of these books. He is openly associated with neo-Nazis. Let's look at the ad.
Third Reich books.
The ad from his webpage today. And it says he's an expert on European history and authority on the white race and its roots.
Oh my God.
So these people are, and he was publishing in the same magazines as Frank Joseph, edited by Frank Joseph, and he's been involved in a lot of real overt neo-Nazi stuff. And then, Corey, we're wrapping up. We're out of time, right? Are you out of time right now?
Essentially, yeah, because it's going to take time after we hit the end record to finish uploading the files.
So we can't get too much into Robert Sepher then. Robert Sepher is the most current one, the one who's like the most prominent, and he is definitely associated with this argument with modern forms of polygenism. And we'll see that Robert Sepher's publishing outfit has taken a Nazi war eagle and just used the lasso feature in Photoshop to remove the Nazi symbol. So his Atlantean Gardens publication company is like closeted neo-Nazi, right? And he is somebody who has apologized. And so I'm not going to talk about all these slides, but let's just say that Robert Sepher one of his arguments is that Honor Noob did nothing wrong. He is somebody who literally is defending the honor and integrity of those old school, unreconstructed Nazi archaeologists from the middle of the last century. Jeez. So these people
I told Corey I wanted to do a video just on this jerk off because I feel that currently he is the most
he's a big prominent person, and people need to wake up. People who think his work is innocuous or that he's doing something that's just like Hancock, and Hancock's followers have been calling him out more recently. That's where they've started to distance themselves from the Nazi proponents. They need to do this more, and they need to realize it's not just Sepper, right? Sepper is currently the most prominent face of this group, but as we've shown you already, there are multiple prominent people that have flirted with and engaged with these famous people in the recent past. Like less than 20 years ago, members of Hancock's inner circle were publicly endorsing the works of people like Chenard and Joseph. So this is not an anomaly, right? These are not bugs. These are actual features of this kind of work. And we can't deny that. And anyone who wants to be a left-wing Atlantis proponent needs to be more vocal in calling out the right-wing stuff. And that's all I got for you right now. We can't go on and on about this, but
yeah, I appreciate it. I definitely want you to come back. I thought you did great. I definitely want to talk about the Nadane and
not Dene.
Sorry, yeah. Not Dene and Yeniseian language stuff or whatever. But also, said to Corey, I do want to address Robert Seffer, just a video on him, because we need to.
Yeah, well, that will be part 2 of this one, because that was the material, because we got sidetracked at the beginning and talked about other topics, so I didn't get a chance to cover all that. Okay, take care. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
Nice
Thank
to meet
you.
you guys. Bye, Corey. Bye, Damien.
All right, take care.
Next time.
Hello, and welcome to my channel. I am Damien Marie AtHope. In the simplest terms, I am an atheist-humanist philosopher and prehistorical writer-researcher at DamienMarieAtHope.com. I am specifically an axiological atheist. An axiological atheism can be thought to involve ethical and value theory reasoned and moral argument driven apatheism, agnosticism, atheism, anti-theism, anti-religionism, secularism, and humanism. Axiological atheists can be understood as a value theory or a value science atheist. As an axiological atheism's ethically reasoned and constructive pro-humanity. I am an axiological thinker, value theorist. The science of goodness, worthiness, usefulness, valuableness, virtue, reliableness, accuracy, validity, morality, integrity, beneficialness, etc., etc. We axiologists have a value consciousness. And in general, we see the architecture of humanistic humanitarianism value in people that we see as dignity beings. Places and things are not. Axiology is a value theory. In its broadest sense, it involves areas of philosophy that are deemed to encompass some evaluative or evaluation aspect. Therefore, it crosses almost all domains in some way or another. Now for a more detailed terms as to what I am. I am an axiological atheist, an anti-theist, an anti-religionist, secularist, humanist, rationalist, writer, artist, poet, philosopher, advocate, activist with schooling in psychology, sociology, as well as I am an autodidact, self-taught in science, archaeology, anthropology, and philosophy. I promote science and am against pseudoscience, pseudohistory, pseudomorality, things that are found in religion.